July is coming, and right now, in the window before peak summer heat, there's a specific list to handle. Miss this window and you spend July and August managing problems you could have prevented in June. Hit every item on this list, and your garden carries itself through the hottest months looking great. It'll actually outperform your neighbor's freshly planted annual beds through the entire summer. Most gardening content tells you to deadhead and call it a season, but that's about 10% of it. Today we're covering the other 90%, the tasks that actually determine how July plays out. These are what separate a garden that thrives through August from one that declines and stops blooming. Drop your US state or zone in the comments, since every task applies a bit differently by region. A gardener in Minnesota and one in Georgia are working with completely different July timelines here. Let's get into it, starting with the task almost everyone thinks they already know how to do. This isn't generic advice either. It's specifically built around what actually happens in July heat. Task 1 is deadheading everything that's finished its first bloom, but not the way most people do it. Deadheading is the most talked about pre-summer task, and also the most consistently misunderstood one. Nearly every gardening blog mentions it, but almost none explain where exactly to make the cut. Most gardeners just snap off the spent flower head and move on, calling the job done right there. That removes the visual mess, but leaves the seed stem in place, still pulling energy towards seeds. That energy should be going toward the new flower buds already developing lower on the same stem. The correct technique is following the spent stem down to the first healthy lateral buds below it. Cut there, at the next active growing point, not right at the flower head itself. That cut redirects the plant's energy immediately into those lateral buds instead of wasted seed production. It accelerates the second flush of bloom that most gardeners never get because they cut in the wrong spot. This one small correction alone can meaningfully change how much color your border produces in August. For coneflowers, cut to the next lateral bud rather than just removing the spent flower head. This keeps the plant looking tidy while genuinely encouraging additional blooms later in the season. For catmint, shear the entire plant back by half, which looks brutal for about 10 days. Trust the process here, since the payoff genuinely arrives right on schedule after that short wait. It returns with a second flush that's often heavier than the very first one you started with. For black-eyed Susan, deadhead to the next developing stem rather than stopping at the flower itself. For daylilies, snap spent blooms daily, then remove the entire scape once every bud has finished. For garden phlox, cut spent heads back to the next set of leaves to prevent unwanted self-seeding. That self-seeding can dilute your named variety into inferior seedlings within 2 or 3 seasons. Staying on top of it protects the specific color and form you originally chose that plant for. Some perennials shouldn't be deadheaded before July at all, and it's worth knowing which ones. Leave coneflower seed heads standing if you want to feed goldfinches through the winter months. Leave sedum flower heads too, since they're just beginning and will carry interest through fall. Leave ornamental grasses completely alone since they're building the seed plumes that define fall. Knowing what to skip is honestly just as important as knowing what actually needs cutting back. Task 2 is cutting back plants that are done for the season and using it to trigger surprise reblooms. Some perennials genuinely don't rebloom, giving you one flush per season and nothing more after that. That fact alone surprises a lot of gardeners who assume every perennial keeps producing new flowers. Most gardeners leave those plants standing through summer looking increasingly ragged and tired. That's a mistake that costs visual space in the border and can invite disease into the garden. A ragged standing stem also traps moisture and debris, creating exactly the environment fungus loves. For first flush only perennials like oriental poppies, bleeding heart, and bearded iris, cut hard. Cut all the way to the basal foliage once their bloom has completely finished for the season. What remains is a clean, low mound of foliage that holds its position without looking like a liability. It also gives neighboring plants a bit more breathing room and light as the border fills in for summer. Here's something most gardening content never mentions about cutting back before July arrives. Several plants assumed to be one-flush performers actually rebloom when cut back hard immediately. This is genuinely one of the least talked about tricks in perennial gardening, and it works reliably. For Salvia nemorosa, cut the entire spent spike mass back by about 2/3 right after blooming. A complete second flush arrives within 4 to 6 weeks of that hard cutback treatment. That's essentially 2 seasons of color from a single plant for the cost of one quick pruning session. For delphinium, cut the spent spike back to basal foliage, and a second set of spikes emerges by late summer. That second flush is often shorter than the first, but still adds welcome color late in the season. Catmint remains one of the most reliable second flush performers when cut back immediately after bloom. The rule here is simple. Cut back immediately after bloom ends rather than waiting for it to look bad. Cut the moment the last flower on the last stem finishes, sending energy into regrowth, not seed. Waiting even a week or two past that point noticeably reduces how strong the second flush turns out. Task 3 is dividing every overcrowded perennial clump before the real summer heat arrives. Overcrowded perennials stop blooming, and that's not a general tendency, it's a biological certainty. It happens to nearly every clumping perennial eventually, regardless of soil quality or how well it's cared for. When a clump grows past its productive root density, the center of that clump actually starts to die out. The plant redirects energy to its outer ring of growth, and bloom production drops dramatically as a result. By the time you actually see the dead center, the clump has usually been struggling for a while already. By the time you notice your cone flowers blooming less, the clump has likely been overcrowded for 2 seasons. June is one of the 2 best windows in the gardening year to divide most perennials, the other being fall. Both windows share the same core advantage, warm soil without the punishing stress of peak summer heat. The soil is warm enough to encourage rapid root establishment right after you divide a clump. The worst heat hasn't arrived yet to stress a freshly divided plant during its most vulnerable phase. The divided plant also has the rest of the growing season to fully establish before winter sets in. Here's a dividing technique most gardening content tends to skip entirely: watering the day before. Never divide a perennial without watering it deeply the day before you plan to do the work. A well-hydrated plant handles division stress dramatically better than one that's already dry. Skipping this simple step is one of the most common reasons a freshly divided perennial fails to take. The root cells stay turgid and are far less prone to drying out during the replanting process. Dig the entire clump and lift it cleanly from the soil so you can properly examine its structure. A healthy dividable clump has multiple distinct crowns, the points where stems emerge from the roots. Take a moment to really look at the clump before cutting into it so you know exactly where to divide. Each division needs at minimum 1 healthy crown with active root mass still attached to it. A crown with no roots attached simply won't survive, and roots with no crown won't regrow either. Crown plus root mass together is genuinely your minimum viable division for successful replanting. Anything less than that combination is unlikely to establish itself in the new location you choose. Replant immediately, never letting a division sit exposed in sun or wind for very long. Water immediately and deeply after replanting, then mulch to retain moisture and reduce transplant stress. Expect some wilting in the first 3 to 5 days, which is completely normal during recovery. Resist the urge to overwater during that stretch, since the roots are simply adjusting, not failing. Established new growth within 2 to 3 weeks confirms the division was genuinely successful. Daylilies, hostas, coneflowers, black-eyed Susan, bee balm, asters, and catmint all need dividing regularly. If you've got any of these in your beds right now, it's worth checking their crowns this weekend. Most of these need it every 3 to 4 years in most American growing zones to stay vigorous. Each division from an established clump is essentially a free plant at current nursery prices. A single morning of dividing a mature perennial garden can produce well over $100 in free plants. That's genuinely not an exaggeration. That's simply the math of perennial gardening done correctly. It's one of the few gardening tasks that actively pays you back instead of costing you money. Task 4 is fertilizing correctly for summer bloom rather than for spring vegetative growth. The fertilizer mistake that costs American gardeners the most bloom production is a common one. It's an easy trap to fall into, since it feels productive to keep feeding your plants through summer. It's applying a high nitrogen balanced fertilizer in late spring, the same one used for spring growth. That's exactly when the plant's biological priority has shifted from growing leaves to flowering. High nitrogen in June does to perennials exactly what it does to tomato plants in a vegetable garden. It produces lush, dark green vegetative growth at the direct expense of flower production. The plant looks vigorous and healthy, but it simply isn't blooming the way it should be. Gardeners often mistake that lush green growth for a healthy plant, when it's actually a warning sign. The nitrogen is winning the internal energy competition against the plant's flowering signal entirely. Switch to a low nitrogen, high phosphorus fertilizer for perennials from June through mid-July instead. Phosphorus drives root development and flower production, the two things your garden needs most right now. Look for a formula where the middle number, phosphorus, is equal to or higher than the first number. That number combination is really all you need to check on the bag before making a purchase. Apply once in early June at the labeled rate, since more fertilizer doesn't actually produce more bloom. Over-applying can actually push growth back toward foliage, undoing the exact benefit you're after. The right fertilizer applied at the right time is what produces more bloom, not simply more volume. The Chicago Botanic Garden uses an alternative across their display gardens that requires no purchased fertilizer. A 3-inch layer of compost worked into the soil around each clump in late spring replaces fertilizer. It's genuinely the simplest option if you'd rather avoid buying and measuring synthetic products altogether. Compost releases nutrition slowly, feeding soil biology rather than bypassing it entirely. It never pushes the nitrogen spike that disrupts flowering the way synthetic fertilizer often does. One annual compost application in May or June is genuinely the entire fertilizer program needed. It's honestly less work than most people expect for the amount of bloom improvement it delivers. Task 5 is setting up your deep watering system before July arrives, not after damage is already done. Shallow daily watering is honestly the most damaging watering practice in American perennial gardening. It's also one of the most common, since daily watering just feels like the responsible thing to do. It feels responsible since you're watering every day, but small daily amounts barely penetrate the soil. Water applied that way only reaches the top inch or two, exactly where roots aren't concentrated. Perennial roots in established plants extend 6 to 18 inches deep, depending on the species. Shallow daily watering never actually reaches most of that root zone, no matter how often you do it. Shallow watering keeps roots near the surface, where they're most vulnerable to heat and drought. Deep, infrequent watering drives roots downward into cooler, more stable soil layers instead. Moisture persists longer in those deeper layers, even through extended dry stretches in summer. The difference in drought tolerance between shallow-rooted and deep-rooted perennials isn't marginal at all. It genuinely determines whether your garden coasts through a heat wave or struggles visibly through it. It's the difference between a plant that looks magnificent through August and one that declines by July. Before July arrives, establish a deep watering routine, 1 inch of water weekly across 2 sessions. That schedule genuinely trains roots to grow deeper instead of staying shallow near the surface. Apply slowly enough that water actually penetrates the soil rather than running off the surface. A simple tune can set under your sprinkler tells you exactly when you've applied a full inch. It's a low-tech trick, but genuinely one of the most reliable ways to measure watering accurately at home. When that can is full, you're done watering for that session and can move on to the next task. Set your watering schedule for early morning exclusively, never in the evening hours. Water on foliage that dries off in the heat of the day creates essentially no fungal risk at all. Water applied in the evening that stays wet through the night creates ideal conditions for mildew. Powdery mildew, black spot, and botrytis all need that warm, moist environment to properly establish. Avoiding evening watering alone can prevent a large share of the fungal problems gardeners deal with. Morning watering, always without exception, is the single rule worth remembering here. Mulch every perennial bed before July arrives, using about 4 inches of shredded bark or straw. That mulch layer reduces soil surface evaporation by up to 70% across the growing season. That reduction means your once-weekly deep watering goes twice as far as it normally would. The soil stays consistently moist between watering events instead of cycling between wet and dangerously dry. Mulch isn't a cosmetic addition to a perennial bed, it's genuinely a water management tool. Think of it as an investment that pays back every single week for the rest of the growing season. It makes everything else you do in the garden meaningfully more effective throughout the season. Task 6 is inspecting for pests and disease now, before the heat accelerates both of them significantly. The 2-week window before July is the most important pest and disease scouting window of the year. Spending 20 minutes now can genuinely save hours of intervention later once things get out of hand. It's not that July brings new pests, it's that summer heat accelerates the spread of what's already there. Aphid populations can double every 4 to 5 days under warm summer growing conditions. That kind of exponential growth is exactly why a small problem in June becomes unmanageable by July. A small aphid colony on catmint leaves in June becomes a full infestation by mid-July if left unchecked. That same colony, identified now, needs only one application of diluted hydrogen peroxide spray to clear. A strong water blast from the garden hose can also eliminate a small colony entirely on its own. Powdery mildew on bee balm and garden phlox starts as faint gray-white patches on the lower leaves. Caught now, you simply remove the affected leaves and apply a preventative spray to stop the spread. Left until July, it covers the entire plant and can only be slowed, never fully reversed at that point. Early detection genuinely makes the difference between a quick fix and a season-long management problem. Examine every perennial bed carefully this week, flipping leaves over to check the undersides closely. Aphids, spider mite webbing, and fungal spore colonies all tend to establish on leaf undersides first. Make flipping leaves part of your regular routine, not just something you do once things look wrong. Check the base of stems at soil level for slugs, which feed at night and hide during the day. They leave ragged, irregular holes in leaves with no visible pest present during daytime inspection. That absence of a visible culprit is exactly why so many gardeners misdiagnose the actual cause. The correct spray for both fungal and pest pressure is 1 tablespoon of hydrogen peroxide per cup of water. Apply it to all leaf surfaces in early morning once per week as your standard preventative protocol. The oxidizing action kills fungal spores on contact and makes leaves hostile to soft-bodied insects. It leaves no residue and creates no chemical buildup in your soil over time, unlike many sprays. That makes it genuinely safe to use weekly all the way through the hottest stretch of summer. That's genuinely your preventative weekly protocol running from right now straight through August. Here's the complete pre-July perennial checklist gathered together in one simple place for reference. Print it, save it, or just come back to this section whenever you need a quick weekend refresher. Deadhead every spent bloom correctly, cutting to the next lateral bud rather than just the flower head. That one habit alone shapes how much color you'll see through the rest of the summer season. Cut back first flush-only perennials immediately once their bloom has completely finished for the season.
Shear rebloomers like catmint and salvia back by half right now to trigger that valuable second flush. Divide every clump that stopped blooming as vigorously as it used to earlier in the season. Free plants and stronger blooms next year make this one of the most worthwhile tasks on the whole list.
Switch to a low nitrogen, high phosphorus fertilizer, or simply apply a 3-inch layer of compost instead. Establish deep, infrequent watering twice per week before the worst of July heat actually arrives. Mulch every bed to about 4 inches deep before the first real heat wave of summer hits. That single afternoon of work will save you countless hours of watering stress later in the season. Scout every single plant for pest and disease pressure this week, while problems are still manageable. That's 8 distinct tasks packed into one pre-July window that genuinely matters more than any other. None of them take more than an afternoon, but together they change how the entire summer plays out. The difference between a garden that looks spectacular through August and one that declines by mid-July. That difference is almost entirely determined by what you do or don't do in the next 2 to 3 weeks. It's a small window, but it's genuinely the most leveraged 2 to 3 weeks of the entire year. If this helped you plan out your weekend, go ahead and subscribe for more zone-specific garden content. This channel puts out practical, experience-based advice built around real American growing conditions. Drop 2 things in the comments before you go, your state or zone, and which task you're tackling first. Every answer genuinely shapes what gets covered in the next video, so we do read every single one. July is coming, and your perennial garden is genuinely ready for it if you decide to be ready too. So grab your gloves, work through this list this weekend, and let your garden do the rest all summer.